Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking all things talent, identification, psychological characteristics with Dr. Daniel Fortin-Guichard. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Most pleased to be here.
Yeah, really excited to have you on. We're going to be talking about a topic that's really close to my heart, something I find so interesting, and questions that are fielded to me every single day in my consultancy practice around psychological characteristics and talent identification. Before we get on to these really interesting topics, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your work and your background.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to for me to lay it down. I did my PhD with Simon Grandin, who's an author on the paper we will be mainly discussing today. He's mainly involved in time perception in fundamental psychology, but he did a master's in physical education, and he was the only one in the university where I did my doctorate that was interested in sport in the psychology department. So I just knocked on his door and I said, I want to do sports psych. And he was like, yeah, well, I haven't done sport in forever, but you're probably very familiar with the relative age effect. And he's actually the father of the relative age effect, because the first publication on the matter was in 1982 in French. It was his master's thesis, actually, and not a lot of people know that.
Really?
So a lot of people cite, I think it's an 1985 or 1986 paper in English, but his one in 1982 was the first one. So I did my doctorate with him about perceptual cognitive skills in volleyball, mainly, trying to differentiate according to the position the players are involved. So setters, hitters, center, etc., mainly with eye movements and decision making. So that's where I started doing sports psych mainly, which was not very clinical, as you can see. It was very, very fundamental, actually. And then I did a postdoc with during my PhD, actually, I did an internship with Damien Farrow that you may know.
Yep.
I did a bunch of stuff with him at the Australian Open in particular, and also helping with the testing of a test battery in talent identification, which kind of sparked, I guess, my interest with talent towards talent ID. So I spent a semester there in Australia, and then before I finished my doctorate, I did a postdoc with David Mann in Amsterdam. He's also Australian, but works at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. I was hired to work with the International Paralympic Committee there. I guess we still are, but we were responsible for research on classification for visually impaired athletes. So our role is to establish the minimum impairment criteria to be eligible to participate in the Paralympic Games for visually impaired athletes, and also within those that are eligible, find cutoffs between potential classes to make competition as fair as possible. And we have to do that for each sport separately, basically. So far, we did judo, swimming is on the way, rifle shooting has been done, football is on the way. So we're doing that. I guess I'm still involved distantly with that. Still involved with David quite a lot in other talent identification projects. And now I'm doing a second postdoc with Joe Baker. We were at York University as of September 1st, but we moved to the Tannenbaum Institute for Science and Sport at the University of Toronto on September 1st. Still getting the lay of the land, I would say, because that's pretty new. But that's where I'm at right now, focusing on talent ID at the moment in ice hockey. I guess my interests are towards any team sport where talent identification can be done, or is done, I should say. But, I'm in Canada, so it makes sense to just use ice hockey as a vehicle to make the research possible. But yeah, I guess that's where I'm at the moment.
You've traveled the world following your passion.
I did actually.
You really have.
I traveled quite a bit, not only for conferences, but also for positions, indeed, internships and in position. However, at the moment, I feel that it's time to settle down, and I think Canada will be my final professional destination. But I mean, who knows, right? Opportunities may arise, but for personal reasons and stuff, maybe Canada may happen to be my final destination. Hopefully, if I get a tenure track somewhere, that's my goal.
You're back home, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so just before we move on to the topics that we're going to talk about, what made you walk down the hallway, knock on the office door of Simon Grandin and say, sports psychology? That's what I want to do. Why sports psychology?
I'm an athlete myself, coaching at the moment because I injured my ACL a few years ago. But I played baseball, volleyball, ultimate frisbee, spike ball, I badminton, karate. I did a lot of sport. So an athlete myself, and I've always been interested in the sport aspect of performance. However, at the university where I did my bachelor, master's, and doctorate, like I said, there was no sports psychology in the psychology department. So I kind of dug whoever could help me do sports psych here. And I got a co-supervisor in the physical education department that you may know, Christian Trottier. So I worked with Simon and Christian as co-supervisors because they were both interested in sports. And I think on Simon's side, I kind of started something because at the moment he's been having other students involved in sport after me. Funny thing is he's quite towards the end of his career, so it's kind of a second passion that arose about 30 years in his career, probably even longer than that. So yeah, interest in sport, interest in the, I guess, mental aspect of performance, and then I just got from there and tried to make the most of it.
You're spending most of your time studying talent identification, specifically around psychological characteristics, leaning on your sports psychology background. And, we're here to unpack a paper entitled Identification of Sleeping Talent Using Psychological Characteristics in Junior Elite Ice Hockey Players. Super excited to discuss that paper in detail and unpack it. But I think a really great area to begin it is in general around talent identification and psychological characteristics. I mean, off air, this is something that you said, this is generally what you study, and it's certainly an area, as I said to you off air, I have so many scouts, especially in the world of soccer, football, who immediately, as soon as they can learn that I'm a sports psychologist, they're like, right, okay, tell me about psychological characteristics. What should I be looking for? What should I be considering? How can we assess these? I don't think I have a particular or specific question for you, Daniel, but just tell me a little bit about a very broad question, if you like. Tell me about psychological characteristics in talent identification. What characteristic? What counts here? What can we be assessing? What should we be looking for?
Yep. Indeed, very broad question.
Yeah, sorry.
That's probably the question I will try to build my career on. So that's that's something I'm happy to discuss. Of course, we always hear about grit. That's there are a lot of grit questionnaires out there. However, so far the empirical evidence related to grit and how to measure it are not super strong yet. Not to say that grit is not important and shouldn't be investigated more, but to the best of my knowledge in talent ID and team sport at the moment, I don't think grit has been the psychological characteristic that stood out the most to, I guess, distinguish those that made it from those that didn't make it. Or it could be just a measurement problem. It could be just the way we measure grit at the moment. One thing that has started to emerge in terms of psychological characteristics around 2010, mainly with the work of Young Kerr, was our self-regulatory skills. especially learning self-regulation. However, emotional self-regulation are super important as well. And I think scouts and coaches should start, if they don't do it already, should start looking for athletes, especially in teenage, that are self-regulated in their learning. It's been shown by this work from younger or early 2010s that it distinguished nationals from internationals during the teenage.
Wow.
And my work in ice hockey kind of corroborated that, showing that those that made it, especially those that were not seen to be as talented early on, those that had self-regulation capabilities had better chance of making it than those that were also not seen as talented as others.
Is that both, just interjecting briefly, is that both emotional self-regulation and learning self-regulation? Both of those are relevant.
I'm talking about learning self-regulation at the moment.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so learning self-regulation is basically to exert a control over one's ability to learn stuff, to extract as much information from the teaching that they receive, basically. And there is a questionnaire out there designed for that. So that's one characteristic that kind of starts to emerge as a potential predictor of talent, I would say, or at least future success in team sports. And individual sports, of course, as well. But I study mainly team sports.
Okay.
And one thing that I think, a third one that I would be very interested in investigating at some point in my career, and I think it's very promising, would be attachment. So it's a very clinical concept, of course, and you need psychologists to evaluate it. Insecure attachment, secure attachment, anxious, avoidant, etc. But I strongly believe, and of course, it's not only from my belief, but also from my readings in scientific work. I do think that athletes with a secure attachment are more likely to attain elite level, and also athletes with an insecure attachment that faced a lot of adversity. We know that adversity can promote success in sports in general. It's not mandatory to have faced adversity in childhood to become successful athletes, but we know that it can help. So people with insecure attachment that faced a lot of adversity but had the social support to make it through, I would be inclined to target those athletes. And of course, those that have secure attachment pattern are also much easier to coach, I would say, and typically much more self-regulated actually in their learning and emotions. So those are the three. Grit is also part of stuff that I want to study at some point. So those are the three mains that I would suggest scouts and coaches to look for in psychological characteristics.
Just honing in briefly on grit. I mean, obviously Angela Duckworth's construct, a passion and a perseverance, having a passion, a long-term passion and perseverance around a specific objective. Do you hold it? I'm interested a little bit as a sports psychologist in personality science. Do you hold any position around the difference between grit and conscientiousness, for example? Because I believe that they've been used interchangeably, conscientiousness being in essence industriousness. Any thoughts on that, or not so much?
Well, not so much, because I'm not a personality psychologist per se. But what I can say is typically conscientiousness, is more used with in clinical context, whereas grit is more used in let's call it applied context, where people that they're looking for players that are willing to put their body on the line, that are that will do anything to pursue their goal, etc. But they have trouble to put maybe a label on it that would resonate with in clinical work. So they might have been used interchangeably, but I do see grit more as a bit more rough concept than consciousness, something that would bring emotion more than conscientiousness would. But again, that could be only me.
Grit, self-regulatory skills, attachment theory. It makes sense to me that those three specific concepts are important mediators of long-term development. To be gritty, to have the capacity to self-regulate and to enjoy secure attachments, thus there being a degree of emotional stability, I suppose.
Exactly.
I mean, I do think that self-regulatory, the learning self-regulation is something that we don't speak about enough, or a lot of, within sports psychology.
And weirdly enough, it's probably the psychological construct that has the most empirical evidence to support at the moment. It's probably the one that has the most support in talent ID in team sport anyway.
And I suppose the principle underpinning talent ID is that, well, we identify somebody who is very good at self-regulated learning. I mean, from a sports psychologist perspective, I'm thinking about the ways that I could potentially help players become better at that self-regulation, or help coaches to help players to become better at self-regulation around learning. But definitely some people are more adept at self-regulated learning. And so for those listening in, as somebody who's studying this every single day, if a scout comes up to you and says, well, how do I detect this? How do I get to know this? And we can specifically hone in on self-regulated learning. I mean, how can a scout, somebody who is involved in recruitment, for example, actually detect self-regulating learning? Is it possible?
Well, of course, you can run with questionnaires if you have access to the athlete. But if you don't, if you have to content yourself with being seated in the stands and only watch, talking with the coaches could be a good way of doing it. I would also maybe point towards those that for whom you observe improvement within a season, especially among those that you kind of discarded early on. Scouts, well, I know from anecdotal evidence that scouts tend to do that. They kind of discard early on those that are not talented at the moment, but their job should not be to find current talent. Their job should be to find future talent. And therefore, maybe a good way to do that would be to revisit their original their original assessment of early season and see who improved the most. So who got the most from the teaching they received during the season, because if they were able to catch up with the rest, not even if they didn't catch up, but if they improve, it's possible that they will keep improving, basically, and it could be attributable to self-regulation. Again, an interview or questionnaire will I guess confirm, or maybe not confirm, but point towards that. But if you really cannot have access to the athletes for 15 minutes, then maybe just revisit your original assessment.
I think that what you're saying is really, really interesting, because I'm certainly no scout, but I'm kind of right now imagining myself, putting myself into the role of one, and thinking about, as you said, sitting in the stands and observing these players, and actually purposefully, intentionally, deliberately trying to notice, for example, baseline behaviors, let's say of a 14-year-old or group of 14-year-olds that we're looking at, with the sole aim of, well, I'm not necessarily going to choose anybody now, but I'm going to absorb some certain baseline behaviors that I'm noticing, come back in 2 years' time, and have some kind of indice of measurement of improvement, even if that's sort of a laissez-faire measurement by just my eye, for example. But if I'm purposefully looking for those baseline behaviors and seeing if they shift, I'm getting what could be considered a degree of snapshot of self-regulated learning.
Yep. That's what I'm saying. Basically, the easy way to do that would be to revisit those that you discarded early on. Because scouts have to, they cannot observe everyone every time they especially if there are 22 players on a pitch, right? In soccer, for instance, they have to make space in their mind to, okay, I will stop observing that one and I will stop observing that one because he's just not good enough. But a good way to see if they have psychological characteristics needed to go to the next level would be to come back in a month, 2 months, 3 months, and see, okay, from those that I discarded, who actually improved the most. Maybe I should put them back in the bin of, okay, potential.
Well, we're talking all things talent. We're putting ourselves in the world of scouts and observing talent. And you've co-written a paper, Identification of Sleeping Talent Using Psychological Characteristics in Junior Elite Ice Hockey Players. And I'm keen to unpack this. Before we unpack the paper in detail, tell us about what is sleeping talent? What do you mean by that term, sleeping?
Yep. I guess it's a concept that received very little empirical attention so far. It could be seen as synonym as hidden gems or whispering talent, or basically players that you would have seen as less talented than the rest at a point A in time, but end up surpassing expectation and actually perform well at an actually higher level of competition. An example of this would be the paper from Jörg Schorer in 2017. It was not the main goal of their paper to find sleeping talent, but they kind of ended up doing it. So they looked at a training camp in handball. I think it was 68 players. At the end of the training camp, they asked coaches to, okay, who are the best 14 right now? 7 coaches. And then 10 years later, they looked at those 68 players. Where are they now? And around 12% of the players in the camp were missed by the 7 coaches. So that those would be sleeping talent, because the coaches did not identify them at, let's call it 14 years old. But at 24, they were high achievers. And even if the scouts were the coaches were actually they were experienced and they knew handball quite a lot. And even more markedly, 2 of those 68 players were on the national team 10 years later, and 1 of the 2 was missed by 5 of the 7 coaches. So those would be examples of sleeping talent. Tom Brady in American football would be an example of sleeping talent. He's probably the best footballer that ever was, at least the best quarterback that ever was. Yeah. Probably, that's debatable, but probably. And he was drafted 199. In 2000. He was almost drafted last on his eligibility year, and he's the best ever. In ice hockey, Martin Saint-Louis was never drafted, and he's now an Hall of Famer. Jonathan Marchessault, never drafted, and won the most valuable player in the playoffs last year in the NHL. So those would be examples of sleeping talent. So people that was largely missed when young, but ended up surpassing expectation, or their peers, I should say, later on in life, maybe because they had the psychological characteristics in them align with pursuing a goal or something like that. I guess we'll discuss that in a second.
Absolutely. But as you're speaking, I'm thinking, how comes it's so hard for sleepers to be identified? What makes it really that difficult, do you think? As you said, that piece of research where 12%, which is a handy amount of players, weren't identified, particularly in high stakes sport, elite sport these days, where you're talking about millions of pounds or millions of dollars being lost as a consequence of missing these players, and a great deal of entertainment for the rest of the world, because that's what we want to see these incredible players. So what makes sleepers so hard to identify?
Yep. There are a lot of reasons, and I think we touch on that in the introduction of the paper. One thing is scouts I touched on that earlier in this podcast as well. Scouts don't have time to schedule everyone in their schedule, basically, to see everyone perform for a decent amount of time, a decent number of repetition as well. So they have to mentally discard some players. They kind of have to. If the player is not good right now, there's a fair chance that he won't be good ever. But there's also a fair chance that he will be good at some point. But scouts have to make mental space. We cannot ask them to evaluate everyone every single time they go. So that would be one example of a reason. Another one would be, it's not clear what talent is. Talent in a given sport, we define talent as at the moment of observation, but we know that it doesn't develop linearly, and the definition of what talent is at a given moment is not even clear. So that could complicate the work of the scouts, of course. And scouts have their own biases. And full disclosure, we are working with Dave Mann on a paper right now about cognitive biases in talent ID, and they have biases. The Jeremy Lin example is a very good example. Do you know Jeremy Lin from basketball?
Yes.
So he was a very good player. I think it was for the Knicks. He was not drafted on his draft year, but one team had a statistical model that predicted that he will become a good player, and they still discarded him because he was Asian American, and there was no example of an Asian American in the NBA. So the scouts had a availability bias, maybe, or in-group favoritism bias, maybe. I don't know, but there was something in the scouts' mind that made them not select him. So it could come from the scout, could come from the definition of talent, could come from the time that the scouts have, could come from the fact that sleepers are not often, but sometimes late mature, late born players in the year as well. I think we showed that in the ice hockey players, actually, that sleepers have higher chances of being born in the last trimester of the year. So scouts should definitely look for those over there in being born late in the year. So a lot of reasons make sleepers so hard to identify, because at a given moment, they are actually probably underperforming. Like the reality is, when they are observed, they are probably underperforming. So we have to find ways to see what's potential compared to what's talent or what's current performance.
Human beings are complex, and the landscape the landscape is complicated, right? Complexity and complication equals chaos, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's a hard job being a scout.
Yeah,
you have to tolerate mistakes, that's for sure.
Well, if I'm a scout and I'm listening in, I'm keen to learn how psychological characteristics can engage with this notion of identifying sleeping talent, and that's what you try to do in this paper. You have written this alongside co-authors Emmy Tetrol, David Paquet, David Mann, and Simon Grandin, and I'd love to unpack this,
sure,
if you can, for us. Obviously, we've spoken a little bit to the psychological characteristics that are involved in talent identification, but you hone in on specific psychological characteristics in this paper.
Yes.
So why don't you take us from the top here? What specifically were you investigating? Put a bit more meat on the bone for us there. Take us through those psychological characteristics and take us through the method that you used.
Okay, will probably be a long monologue, but I'll be happy
to go for it. We're listening in.
Happy to go for it. Earlier, when you mentioned which characteristics scouts should be looking for, I probably omitted perceptual cognitive skills. That scouts should be looking for those. We know that they do. We know that scouts already do look for good decision makers, good people with anticipation, etc. So I should have probably added this to the list. Some people don't put perceptual cognitive skills in the same bin as psychological characteristics. But from my psychological background here, cognitive processes are taught in school of psychology. So in my mind, they are psychological skills as well, because it's a treatment of the mind about the environment. So
can I interject and audaciously agree with you on that one? For me, psychological is mental and cognitive. That's a very broad statement, but for me, absolutely spot on. Please carry on.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, I should have probably included them because in my opinion, they are psychological characteristics. So yeah, what sparked the idea was from the internship I did with Damien Farrow in Australia, where we were testing a battery of tests on Australian football rules. One of the tests was a decision-making test on screen. Other tests were biomechanical, physiological, etc., technical, etc. It was a very, very broad battery. I think there were like 6 or 7 stations. It was a full day for 30 kids and rotating. But then when I got back to Quebec, I'm still working with the Quebec Remparts, which is a major junior team in ice hockey. They were coached as of last year by Patrick Roy, which is probably the best goaltender ever in the NHL, if you know ice hockey a bit. So I went to Patrick and I just told him, hey, I think I can help your scouts. From what I just did in Australia, I think I can help your scouts. Would you be willing to let me present my ideas? And he was super inclined. So I wanted to, he gave me 20 minutes per player. So I was like, okay, 20 minutes. So I have to capture the psychological profile of a kid of 15 years old in 20 minutes. So I bargained for 30 minutes and I got it. So that's
nice.
And then I just dug the literature, to be honest. So from what I was doing in my thesis and what I did with Damien Farrow, I went towards perceptual cognitive skills. So what I did was temporal occlusion with eye movements on ice hockey video sequences. So the video sequence just plays, it stops at a given moment, and the athlete has to anticipate what's coming. They would tell us what they would do if they were in this situation, and we measured eye movements on the screen at the same time. A lot of debates are in the scientific literature at the moment regarding temporal occlusion. Should it have been virtual reality? Should it have been in situ, etc.? But with the resources we had and the time given by the team with the players, we decided to go temporal occlusion. And then we can come back after that, because that's what I'm doing right now. I'm comparing temporal occlusion with other tools meant to measure perceptual cognitive skills.
Gotcha.
And then the second test I decided to include was from these studies from Juncker in early 2010s about self-regulatory skills, because it was promising at the time. So those two tests together, roughly half an hour per player, they got on board. So what happens is every year, the Remparts, they have 9 scouts that go through the Maritimes provinces, the Quebec province. They just go see games. Every week they see games. I don't go see games with them. However, once a year in the month of May, April and May, we meet with those players. We have 15 to 20 minutes with each player for whom the Remparts have an interest. So they've seen them play all year. And then they spot around 100 that they're like, okay, we have an interest towards this guy. Let's meet with him. But since 2019 now, those minutes are mine, basically. They ask me, please use those interviews to capture the psychological profile of those kids. So I did, like I said, I went in the literature, self-regulatory learning, and then perceptual cognitive skills. And then I spent 20 minutes, 30 minutes with each kid measuring these two constructs. And then I made models, which are the ones published in the paper, to show that it was actually possible to isolate those that ended up making it later on, based on their psychological profile at 15 years old. So what we did with that is we only meet with the players once. We don't remeasure them on their psychological characteristics later on, but the statistics are publicly available. So the number of games they played, number of goals, number of assists, differential, which is the plus and minus, the number of times you're on the ice when your team score compared to number. All those are publicly available. And what we also did is 3 years later, we re-asked the scouts, okay, we are 3 years later. You've seen those kids play for 3 years. From those that were drafted late, so there are 14 rounds of draft in the major junior level in Quebec. Each team can pick, therefore, 14 players, unless trades happen, but let's not get in there. From those that were drafted from the third round and later, who should you have picked? In retrospect, now that you've seen those kids play, who should you have picked? In 2019, we met 95 kids. Of those 95, 25 were drafted in the first 2 rounds. Therefore, 70 were drafted in the third round or later or not drafted. Mm-hmm. And we asked the scouts, out of those 70 players, who should you have picked? And they identified 15. They did not know on what basis those 15, they reselected those 15. Of course, it was only a theoretical selection. They did not actually trade to get those players. But those 15 players had a very, very specific psychological profile. And we were surprised how homogenous they were 3 years later. So out of 15, 12 shared a very homogenous psychological profile. And they only shared it with 8 of the other 55. So it's both, it's a very, very good discriminating model that we found there. And this model states that those 12 players, well, I should say those 20 players, right? 12 plus 8, but 20 of those players were from the 55 that they did not select. They had strong self-regulatory capabilities, especially in terms of planning, but that could be due to chance. Like we had six different subscales, and basically they were very correlated together. So the model kept planning, but we stay very careful and say self-regulatory skills, because it's possible that planning was just slightly more correlated with our main variable above the rest of the subscales. So let's call it self-regulatory. So they had that. What they had also is that they performed fewer ocular fixation during the video footage. But those fixations were on more numerous areas of interest. So the ideal pattern would have been, let's call it 4 areas of interest available on screen. That means that the ideal player would have visited each of those areas of interest, but only once. So 4 fixations on 4 areas of interest with high self-regulatory skills, that players would have been predicted to be a sleeper. Basically, a late drafted players that ended up making it to play at the major junior level, and not only play, but also being wanted by a team of scout 3 years later.
So those players had a distinct and similar pattern of self-regulatory skills and perceptual cognitive skills, is what I'm hearing.
Exactly. And we redid the analysis, removing the opinion of scouts. So like I said, we asked the scouts, who should you have picked in retrospect? They identified 15, but more than 15 actually played in the major junior level. Actually 38 had played at the major junior level. So we compared those 38 with the 32 that didn't play. And we still found a very similar, not the exact same model, but a close enough model to show that self-regulatory skills are still important, just to predict who actually played at the major junior level. And this model included the scouts' original appreciation, which the other model didn't. That will be found in the supplementary material of the paper, so it's not in the main paper per se. But yeah, so the model was replicated that way and was pretty strong. So indeed, your comprehension is sound. We did find that sleeping players had distinctive self-regulatory and perceptual cognitive skills.
So As a researcher that's passionate about this area, that's inquisitive about this area, what, when you reflect on these results, when you sat down to write the discussion piece here, what were your thoughts? What were your conclusions about these findings?
Yeah, the first thing is we were quite surprised how strongly we were able to predict. And we had to, I guess, we had to be very calm about it, because we didn't find the holy grail, right? We published one study that shows that, and then this will need replication. And I'm not saying that every scout in the world in every sport should focus on self-regulation, and it's probably context specific, and also it has its own limitations, etc., etc. But the first thing still was we were surprised how strong our model was. That's for sure, and we mentioned it in the discussion indeed. But we did build the discussion around the fact that, well, we may have found something here. It's possible that psychological characteristics are typical for sleeping talent, and therefore scouts should not discard some players too early in their selection process, or at least in their observation process, I should say. And then I mentioned earlier that we also found that those born later in the year had a higher odds of being sleepers compared to other late draftees. So scouts should probably look for players born later in the year if they're looking for sleepers. The main idea behind the discussion here is scouts are good to identify current talent. They already know who is good at the moment. Those players will be drafted in the first and second round. Like those, everyone will jump on the same ones in the first and second rounds. But if you want to find a hidden gem or a sleeper past the second round, look for psychological characteristics beyond technical skills. Those are more likely, or at least are more likely to make it to the next level if they have it's not to say that they have the ideal psychological profile, but at least that they show some strength psychologically.
They might just take slightly longer to shine.
Exactly. 15 years old is still quite young, right? And that's exactly it. Their self-regulatory skills probably allowed them to develop the skills needed to catch up with the rest. Basically, they learned more in those 3 years than the rest. So it's very possible that their self-regulatory skills helped them. The other thing is, it's possible that their perceptual cognitive skills, if we assume that we measured it properly, it's possible that their perceptual cognitive skills helped them as well catch up. However, they might have been too small or too slow or whatever originally, and then but they had an inherent ability to read the game properly, but it didn't show because they were too slow, too small, too whatever. But when they got time to catch up with the rest, then their perceptual cognitive skills were actually be able to perform the action that they saw in their mind. Let's call it like that. It's one thing to decide in your mind, but if you're not able to perform it, then of course scouts won't notice you. But it's possible that once you grew up or got faster or whatever, then your ability to read the game kind of caught up with the rest.
And there's an interesting dynamic within all of this. And please excuse me, because you may have just alluded to this, but that dynamic being that if I'm a young player, a young person who perhaps is slightly behind physically, as an example, maybe even slightly behind technically, but I have those self-regulatory skills, actually, I might go on it and succeed as a consequence of the adversity that I experience because of my lack of physicality. But when drawn with relation to my self-regulation skills, my perceptual cognitive skills, actually, it's those psychological characteristics have been utilized for me to be able to catch up and then pass.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You were just not very lucky that the selection moment was when you were 15. You were just ready later, which is a shame, basically, because we it's possible that we have missed that talent.
And I mean, speaking about missing talent, I mean, obviously we've been speaking a lot to, and the paper is obviously about ice hockey and scouts and bringing talent into your club, your team, your organization. But I'm thinking of the pertinence of this for talent development pathways in all sports. You know, here in England, let's say in soccer, football, the English Premier League, the great work that the academies do, but they'll talk about, you know, the limitation and limited resources around, well, we can only populate, have a certain amount of a population within our teams, within our talent development pathways. And so often maybe they have to make choices, but they make the choices often on what they see in front of them, often the physicality, the technical side. And I'm not suggesting that they won't take a very sophisticated approach. I know they now do, but what you're speaking to here is actually it might make some key decision makers stop, think, consider that self-regulatory capacity, consider the perceptual cognitive skills that are going to mediate development in the next few years, and subsequently keep a player on for a little bit longer. There's a great saying going on, we've heard it on the Sports Psych show before, as many as possible, as long as possible, as good as possible, essentially.
It's exactly that. And one solution for that, because you're totally right, they cannot train everyone. That's not happening. Resources are limited. It makes sense. And also you want players selected to feel special. Weirdly enough, you want them to feel that they were selected in a very high-end program, and that they feel important that you selected them. So you cannot train everyone. That's for sure. One solution for this is to create just a parallel system. I think they started in the Netherlands. Actually, I know they started in the Netherlands. It's probably not only in the Netherlands, but it's not actually a B team. It's just a parallel team for players that might not have the physical maturity yet, the technical capabilities yet, but that you've seen something in them, either perceptual cognitive skills, either self-regulatory skills, either born later in the year. So those parallel teams usually will require the players to be born evenly in the year. So you would have 4 players in the first trimester, 4 players in the second, 4. Whereas in your main team, you will probably have nine in the first 6 months and 3 in the last 6 months, or something like that. So that would be a solution, just to keep an eye on those players that may have potential rather than talent.
And as you're speaking there, it's making me think of the great work going on at the moment at AIK, a football club in Stockholm, Sweden. They have a youth setup, a talent development setup, whereby they have those parallel squads, if you like. And I'm not suggesting that they're using your indices. They might well do, but certainly they're distinguishing between. It's essentially, my understanding from a very simplistic perspective, an opt-in to a participative program versus an opt-in to a more advanced, serious pathway, if you like. And that is one way of doing something like this, just to keep people in the pathway, so that we can actually see, okay, well, let's see how good this person is going to get, as many as possible, as long as possible, as good as possible.
Exactly. And I would suggest from personal just knowledge or opinion that this parallel program, I would suggest that rather than having a squad every year or something like that, maybe you have one every 2 years or something, so that you actually give them a chance to catch up, and a legitimate chance. Of course, if you enter them in a parallel program for only 1 year and they don't grow up, or they don't get faster or whatever, you would be tempted to even discard them from this parallel program. But that would not be the goal of this parallel program. It would be to give a chance to those that you see with potential, not current performance. They can be good currently as well, but it would not be the main characteristics of this team. It would be, and if the other academy next door does the same thing, then it really doesn't matter, because those two teams will face each other. So you don't really care if they're stronger or not than the other. They're supposed to be made of same type of player, or at least the preference of a given academy would probably show up way more in that parallel squad. Because if you have an academy that tend to prefer players with potential that are fast, or players with potential that are tall, or whatever, then you would probably put them in that team. So yeah, that would be one of the solution, I think.
Just fascinating stuff. And we actually spoke to Dr. Martin Erikstad in episode 240 about this. It's entitled "As Many as Possible for as Long as Possible." So we spoke to some of this stuff previously on the Sports Site show. What's the latest on all this research? I mean, you've mentioned a few things already in terms of how you've moved on from this specific piece of research. What are you involved in right now within the world of talent identification and psychological characteristics?
Yep. Well, one thing I'm doing right now is work on Scouts' cognitive biases with David Mann and Dan Mueller in Amsterdam. It's a paper that we will submit in a very near future. So pretty excited about that. But what I'm mainly involved with right now is a project that I probably should have done before my involvement with the Remparts. So I'm comparing different tools that are meant to measure perceptual cognitive skills, from very not ecological to very ecological in terms of science, of course. Not ecological would be a typical IQ test. Second least ecological would be the NeuroTracker that you are probably familiar with. Third would be the temporal occlusion with eye movements that I actually used. The fourth one will be virtual reality. And the fifth one will be small-sided games observed by professional scouts. So I will compare these five and see which one best correlates with the coach's judgment of who is the best decision maker on the ice. And like I said, I should have probably done that before, because I would not have used, if temporal occlusion with eye movement doesn't end up being the best predictor of the coach's impression of who makes the best decision, then maybe I should not have been doing that since 2019. But I did what I did with what I knew from the literature, and we have decent results. So I'm quite confident that it will be at least correlated, maybe not the most correlated, but it would be at least correlated. So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the moment. And then the next thing will be to see if the predictors that we observed in the paper, in the sleepers paper, if those predictors are stable towards time. So we are still working with the Remparts, and we met players in 2022, 2023. We will meet players in 2024, 100 per year approximately. And those players will play at the major junior level. Those that were drafted in 2022 already have a one season in. Of course, the pandemic prevented us from recruiting in 2020 and 2021. But in 5 years from now, we will have a massive data set of psychological characteristics at 15 years old, from the first cohort being the one in the sleepers paper, but we will have 4 cohorts by then. And all those players will have played their junior career, because they play from 16 to 20 years old. And therefore, we will be able to verify if the predictors that we observed in the sleepers paper, namely self-regulatory skills, a high number of area of interest fixated with fewer fixations, we will be able to counter-verify if those predictors stay true cohorts after cohorts after cohorts. We know from scientific work that it's usually not the case. The predictors that are observed on a cohort are usually not super stable across cohort. But of course, if we can show that those are stable, then we may have found something very interesting. So around 2025, 2026, we will try to publish a paper that will assess the stability of those predictors. And then I guess the ultimate step at some point will be to just run a psychological combine, probably. So I want to be a professor. I want to have a tenure track, and I want my lab in talent ID through psychological characteristics. That's my personal goal. Well, I guess my personal professional goal, I should say. And ultimately, what I would like to do is have collaboration with professional teams that would be willing to have the player not only do a bench press and a sprint but I know they're already in equal measure, but I would like them to be based on the science we've been publishing for in the few years prior, basically.
Wow, Daniel, that sounds really, really exciting. And what I can certainly tell you is that come 2025, we'll probably be up to episode number 400 or something like that. So, and it would be fantastic to have you back on, perhaps not as long as waiting as long as 2025, perhaps each year to assess how it's all going and what new stuff that you're learning in this absolutely fascinating field. I'm keen to learn from you, that's for sure. And I know many others will be, and I know that you will have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So how can people find you, follow you, and get in contact if you wish to be contacted?
Yeah, email will be the best way to do it. Like I said, the University of Toronto is pretty new for us at the moment, so the email address has not been settled yet. But I still frequently use my U Laval, where I did my doctorate, email. I'm not very big on social media. That's probably bad for my professional career, but I'm not very active on, well, I was going to say Twitter. I should have said X.
Yep.
I'm not very active on LinkedIn and stuff like that. I'm pretty active on ResearchGate though. So if people want to contact me through ResearchGate, I'm pretty active there. But email will be the best way to do it.
Okay, fantastic.
And I'll be happy to come back next year if you are keen.
We'll be delighted to host you again. Really excited to unpack more research projects that you're doing in the future. Daniel, can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that episode, and I'd love to hear what you think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.